Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next season of the Leuven Colloquia and Ancient Platonism. And we have a very distinguished speaker for today, one of the most, if not the most distinguished of all scholars working on ancient Platonism, Professor John Dillon from Dublin. And well, it's almost unnecessary to introduce John, because everyone interested in ancient Platonism and Platonism in general knows who John Dillon is. He's one of the persons who shaped the field ever since his work on Iamblichus, the fragments of Iamblichus, and his work on the Middle Platonists. Famous books, and then for the decades after that, John has been publishing many other very interesting books and countless articles. So we're very happy to have him here among us today. And John, I pass the floor to you. So please, John.
Yeah, many thanks for that very generous introduction. I'm happy to be with old friends here. I'm only sorry I can't be there in person. I propose to speak today in defense of matter, which is a rather downtrodden aspect of the Platonic universe. But we'll see what we can do for it. If there's one thing one would think that could be assumed in the Platonic tradition to have a uniformly bad press, it is matter. For Plato and his successors, following a doctrinal tradition enunciated most forcefully perhaps in the Timaeus, matter, though the actual term hyle is not of course used by Plato, is seen as the ultimate cause of the imperfection of the physical world, something that can be molded and brought to order by the activity of reason, represented mythologically by the demiurge, but never entirely subdued. Even when under Stoic influence, matter is presented as not positively disorderly and recalcitrant, but purely passive and receptive, as seems to be the case in the Stoicizing tradition stemming from Antiochus of Ascalon. One can refer to such a passage as Cicero's Academica Posteriora 24 following. It said it still is hardly a positive feature of the world, even though essential to its existence. Oh, but that is not the whole story on matter. Its ontological status can be significantly affected according as a monistic tendency, as opposed to a dualistic one, prevails within the Platonic tradition. In the Middle Platonic period, with such predominantly dualistic thinkers as Plutarch and Numenius on the loose, matter, together with a disorderly soul, takes on an independent existence, such as finds support in a literal interpretation of the Timaeus. For Plutarch, one may cite in particular his presentation of such figures as Ahriman or Ahrimanius, or Seth Typhon in the essay on Isis and Osiris, 369e, but also his description of the indefinite dyad on the obsolescence of oracles, 428f, as the element underlying all formlessness and disorder. For Numenius, we may adduce a long passage presenting his doctrine of matter, preserved by Chalcidius in his commentary on the Timaeus, sections 295 to 9, where he presents matter, while being fluid and without quality, as being a positively evil force, and indeed criticizes the Stoics for postulating it as indifferent and of a median nature. Now, I have to say that one can find a more neutral a positive view of matter in such a work as Alcinous' Didascalikos. So that is not the whole story about things. But on the whole, it is pretty dualistic. With Plotinus, however, Platonism takes on, or arguably returns to, a firmly monist position, according to which matter, like every other level of existence, is ultimately generated by the first principle, the one. This does not certainly prevent Plotinus from taking up on occasion a strongly adversative attitude to matter, as for instance in his treatise on matter, and he had 2 forms, chapter 6 to 16. Though even here he is concerned to present it as, above all, privation, steresis, and negativity. The main thing, nonetheless, is that in Plotinus' system, again, despite some rhetoric on occasion, for instance, the beginning of 5.1, about daring, tolma, and falls, there's no question but that the physical world is a necessary development, and there's no adverse force in the universe striving for chaos and disorder. The imperfections of the physical world are irreducibly bound up with its 3-dimensionality, its solidity. Things just get in each other's way and cut across each other on this level of existence, in a way they do not in the intelligible realm. There's a nice passage on this topic in the last chapter of his great treatise on Providence, Ennead 3.3.7, where he presents the physical world as resembling a vast and tangled bush, springing from a single root, but with branches and even twigs getting in each other's way and causing trouble. Anyway, matter, however, is here far from being divinized or in any way exalted. When we turn, on the other hand, to the world of the Greco-Roman, or for that matter, the Egyptian or Jewish magicians, things are far otherwise. Here we find a very different attitude to matter and material substances, of a sort that has been acutely discerned to be akin rather to a scientific view of the world than to a religious or philosophical one. I think of such a work as that of Georg Luck on Arcana Mundi. The objective in magical circles is not to deplore one's presence in the physical world, nor yet to escape from it, but rather to make use of its resources for one's practical purposes. The properties of material substances are to be catalogued and studied, and then to be applied in various notionally effective combinations to achieve a variety of practical outcomes, benign and otherwise. And that's what I'd characterize as a sort of scientific attitude, dotty as it all is. Let me use an example or two, just from magical texts which I happen to have had a hand in translating as part of the team carrying out the Chicago translation of the Greek magical papyri under the leadership of Hans-Dieter Betz back in the 70s. The first is a formula for remembering what is said, something that I'd happily avail of these days. Apparently, though, in connection with the seeking of a revelation from Apollo. So, Papyri Greek Magic 2:17-21. In order to remember what is said, use the following compound. Take the plant wormwood, a sun opal, a breathing stone, that is to say a magnet, the heart of a hoopoe. Grind all these together, add a sufficiency of honey, and anoint your lips with the mixture, having first incensed your mouth with a grain of frankincense gum. We may note here the use of a set of substances comprising animal, vegetable, and mineral classes. That is to say, hoopoe, wormwood, opal, and magnet. Sorry, the magnetic lodestone, put together to generate what one might term a power compound, with the purpose here of constraining a god through harnessing the force of cosmic sympathy. Each of these components has various powers attached to it by itself. The hoopoe is the sacred bird in Egypt. Wormwood has curative and stimulative powers. Among other things, it stimulates the imagination. Sorry. The opal was thought to increase mental capacity. And the magnet likewise. In combination, they would be expected to set up a compelling chain reaction. Again, we have a spell to gain control of one's shadow. Though exactly what the advantage of that might be is left unstated. I can't myself think. If you make an offering of wheaten meal and ripe mulberries and unsoftened sesame and uncooked thrion, and throw into this a beet, you will gain control of your own shadow, so that it will serve you. That's the advantage. Go at the 6th hour of the day towards the rising sun to a deserted place, girt about with a new male palm fiber basket, and on your head a scarlet cord as a headband, behind your right ear the feather of a falcon, behind your left ear that of an ibis. Having reached the place, prostrate yourself, stretch out your hands, and utter the following formula. Cause now my shadow to serve me, because I know your sacred names, and your signs and your symbols, and who you are at each hour, and what your name is. The spell goes on to prescribe the recitation of an address to the sun given earlier, in which all his names, signs, and symbols for each hour of the day are listed, with the purpose of gaining power over him. This will induce the sun to cause your shadow to serve you. Here we have the combination of the right material objects joined together in the right way. As I say, how exactly one was intended to wear the palm fiber basket is not made clear, presumably around one's middle. That, together with a large feather protruding from either ear, should have produced an effect sufficient to attract the notion of the sun himself. Anyway, with the correct magical formula, you bring about an advantageous change in the physical world. It's out of this magical milieu, rather than from any part of the Platonist tradition itself, that arises a much more positive evaluation of matter, characteristic of theurgy. What we find when we turn to the philosopher Iamblichus of Chalcis, which is, whom, as Jan mentioned, was my first love, really, then I would suggest it's an attitude to matter characteristic of the magical, or what one might charitably term the scientific tradition, but with a significant degree of distancing from that tradition in respect of its attitude to the gods and to divine and demonic intervention in the physical world. What Iamblichus would particularly disavow, as indeed he does explicitly in the De Mysteris, Book 4, sections 1 to 4, in response to the jibes of Porphyry, is the suggestion that the theurgist is in any way concerned to compel the gods to do his will. He is simply, by virtue of his expertise with the manipulation of matter and his knowledge of the appropriate formulae, enabling the gods to exercise their benevolent power as they are perfectly happy to do. He is not constraining them, he is merely facilitating them. The gods, he says, and the classes of beings superior to us, through a wish for the good and with an ungrudging fulfillment of benefits, bestow with benevolence towards the saints, oi hagi oi, it's so nice he uses that, rather with a dig at the Christians perhaps, an expression for the theurgists. What is fitting to them? Exhibiting compassion towards the labors of priestly men and embracing their own offspring, nurslings and pupils. As I say, these theurgical procedures rely on the premise that from the divine perspective, matter is not something to be despised or shunned. It is rather an integral part of the universe, to be availed of by the gods and other higher beings when properly organized and presented to them by an expert. for the providential ordering of the physical world. To illustrate this position, let us consider a passage from De Mysteriis, Book 5, 23, section 233, where Iamblichus is concerned with the theory and practice of sacrifice. In this connection, he addresses the question of the status of matter, le. And let there be no astonishment if in this connection we speak of a pure and divine form of matter. For matter also issues from the Father and Creator of all, uses the patriarcha demiurgos, and thus gains its perfection, which is suitable to the reception of the gods. And at the same time, nothing hinders the superior beings from being able to illuminate their inferiors, nor yet by consequence is matter excluded from participation in its betters, so that such of it as is perfect and pure and of good type is not unfitted to receive the gods. For since it was proper not even for terrestrial things to be utterly deprived of participation in the divine, earth also has received from each part from such participation a share in divinity, such as is sufficient for it to be able to receive the gods. Observing this, and discovering in general, in accordance with the properties of each of the gods, the receptacles adapted to them, the theurgic art in many cases links together stones, plants, animals, aromatic substances, and other such things that are sacred, perfect, and godlike. And then from all these composes an integrated and pure receptacle. Hypothekein holotele kai katharan abragadstai. I think we can conclude from such a passage as this, these symboli have been sown by the gods in matter eternally, and that it is part of the divine dispensation, consistent with the operations of fate and providence, that certain privileged persons, priests of old and the theurgists of Iamblichus' own day, should be able to ferret them out and make proper use of them. Their presence is therefore not to be regarded as inconsistent with an eternally ordered universe. He continues with a glance in the direction of those philosophers, such as Porphyry, who professed a generally low view of matter. One must not, after all, reject all matter, but only that which is alien, alotria, to the gods. Well, we don't know what that is, really. That's just dirt and rubbish. While selecting for use that which is akin to them, as being capable of harmonizing with the construction of dwellings for the gods, the consecration of statues, and indeed in the performance of sacrificial rites in general. But there is no other way in which the terrestrial realm or the men who dwell here could enjoy participation in the existence that is the lot of the higher beings, if some such foundation be not laid down in advance. We must, after all, give credit to the secret discourses, the aporetoi logoi, when they tell us how a sort of matter is imparted by the gods in the course of blessed visions, Macaria Theamata. This is presumably of like nature with those who bestow it. So the sacrifice of such material rouses up the gods to manifestation, to ekphansis. They appear. When you call them, they will appear. Summons them to reception, welcomes them when they appear, and ensures their perfect representation. Yes. There are a number of examples in the Magical Papyri, in fact, of objects like a stone being brought to the magician by an eagle or something of the sort, which is obviously a sacred object of some sort. This last remark presumably means that's about ensures their perfect representation, that the use of proper material provides the gods with a suitable medium in which to manifest their characteristic natures. The whole passage constitutes a strong assertion of the positive view of matter, characteristic of the magical tradition on which Iamblichus is basing himself. Iamblichus is, after all, not a magician, but a Platonic philosopher, despite what E.R. Dodds might say about him. And we may expect to see in him some attempts to subsume this higher valuation of matter into his general philosophical system. This we find, in fact, later in the De Mysteries in Book 8, Chapter 3, where he is in his persona of Abaddon, purporting to present the philosophical principles of the Egyptians, as recounted in the books of Hermes. As it turns out, the Egyptians profess a set of principles closely resembling those of Pythagoras. But as Iamblichus would say, that's not surprising. That's where he got his principles from. And thus it is, he says, that the doctrine of the Egyptians on first principles, starting from the highest level and proceeding to the lowest, begin from unity, N, and proceeds to multiplicity, Plethos, the many being in turn governed by a unity. And at all levels, the indeterminate nature, the aoristus vis, being dominated by a certain definite measure, what is men on metron, and by the supreme causal principle that unifies all things, enia panto and aitia. As for matter, God derived it from substantiality, ousiotes, when he had abstracted from it materiality, heulotes, so kind of principle behind matter. This matter, which is endowed with life, the demiurge took in hand, and from it fashioned the simple and impassible as the heavenly spheres. While its lowest element, eschathon, he crafted into bodies, which are subject to generation and corruption. Here matter is put more properly in its place, from a Platonist point of view, as the lowest manifestation of a purifying and generative force that makes its appearance at the highest level of the universe as the indefinite dyad, or multiplicity, deriving directly from the one, as indeed it does in Plotinus' system. Even here, though, we may note a higher grade of matter used by the demiurge for the crafting of the heavenly bodies, which are eternal and unchanging. What the precise relationship between ousiotes and heulotes may be is not quite clear from the rather tortuous syntax of Iamblichus's prose here, but he seems to envisage this archetype of matter as being somehow split off, hyposkistese, from substantiality, in a manner somewhat reminiscent of the system of the Neo-Pythagorean Moderatus of Gades, as reported by Porphyry in Simplicius's commentary on the physics, page 230-34 following deals, where Moderatus' second one also termed the heniaios logos, of which the heniaia aitia mentioned in the present passage may be a reminiscence, wishing to produce from itself the generation of beings by withdrawing itself, katasteries and haltu, left room for quantity, posotes, depriving it of all its logoi and forms. So by a certain withdrawal, it produces in a negative way matter. This appears to reverse the order of seniority to be observed in Plotinus between the indefinite dyad as the primary outflow, aporoi from the one, and intellect, which only constitutes itself as a result of the reversion of this outflow, and its reflection upon its source, and is thus logically secondary to the dyadic element. But it is not really in contradiction with it, I think. The outflow as a material principle can be contemplated as distinct from the intellect, which is also substance, which is being generated from it, so indirectly. And in this way can be separated off. Initially as intelligible matter, which Plotinus, for instance, in Ennead 2:4, the first half of it, chapters 1 to 5, sees as the common substratum of the forms within the realm of intellect. Furthermore, in the Platonian universe, the process of emanation continues from intellect downwards to produce soul, and from soul to produce nature and the physical world, with in each case an indefinite dyadic power splitting off from below the higher hypostasis, allowing the lower hypostasis to substantialize itself by reversion. In this particular sense, materiality can be viewed as subordinate to substantiality. At any rate, we can see matter here as being treated of in a philosophic context and consigned to a lowly status, though with the reminder that it is an offshoot of a force that pervades the universe from its highest level. We can see this scenario presented also in a passage of another work of Iamblichus, the De Communi Mathematica Scientia, chapter 4, which I've elsewhere made considerable use of in reconstructing the philosophical system of Speusippus, slightly controversially probably, but which may equally well be used to elucidate Iamblichus' own position, as he's plainly adopting the doctrine here as compatible with his own. He starts of mathematical numbers, well, because he's talking about mathematics in this treatise, so I think one can reasonably substitute of things generally. One must postulate two primary and highest principles, archai. The one, which should not even be called existent by reason of its simplicity and its position as principle of everything else, a principle being properly not yet that of which it is the principle, and another principle, multiplicity, plethos, which has the capacity in itself to generate division, diairesis, and which for this reason we might, if we are to give the most suitable possible characteristic of it, liken to a completely fluid and malleable matter. Hygera tene pentapasicae euclade ule. Here we have the secondary principle in Speusippus' terminology, multiplicity, assuming this is a representation of Speusippus' position, represented as a completely fluid and malleable hule. In attributing this passage to Speusippus, I chose to translate hule rather tentatively as raw material, in recognition of the fact that it is Aristotle that is generally reputed to have first used this term to characterize the substratum of any particular form, or a form in general. Though I venture to suggest there that there was nothing preventing his contemporary Speusippus having used it as well, at least in a tentative manner. However, for Iamblichus himself, there's no problem. Multiplicity of the indefinite dyad is definitely characteristic as the archetype of matter, characterizable as the archetype of matter, and as itself a sort of matter. Matter in the proper sense seems to make its appearance at a lower level of the universe, coming after soul, at what Iamblichus describes as the fourth and fifth levels of reality. Page 18:9 following Festa, which I've suggested, in the Heirs of Plato, may represent the levels of living corporeal beings and of inanimate nature. But in fact, Iamblichus and or Speusippus talk rather of the arising of ugliness and evil, to eiskron, kai tokakon, which even then arises not principally pro egomenos, but as a result of a falling away from, ekpipte, and failure to control what is in accordance with nature. This is a portrayal of the realm of matter in its normal Platonist mode, though with a distinctly monistic and positive emphasis. And other such references can be gleaned from various passages of Iamblichus' commentary on the Timaeus, for instance, fragments 9 and 46 in my collection, where the chief characteristic of matter is the introduction of diversity and otherness, heterotes. But even here, the continuity of the universe in its various levels is emphasized. and the incidental nature of evil as the result of instances of falling away from natural norms. There's nothing really wrong with matter as such. It is simply a manifestation at the lowest level of the indefinite dyad, the principle of heterotes, which is an essential element in the composition of the universe. But what I've sought to argue then in this brief paper is that an important consequence of Iamblichus's preoccupation with theurgy is that he is driven to take over from the magical and alchemical tradition a positive view of the material world that has a certain resemblance to that of modern science. According to such a tradition, in the hands of a properly trained and disciplined expert, material objects can be made to serve as instruments of divine beneficence. And these objects have intrinsic power, even independent of the expertise of the practitioner. This does not involve a denial of the material world, the denial that the material world is a messy and impermanent place and should ultimately be transcended by the human soul. But it does assert that it has certain positive features. There's a fine defense of the theurgic position to be found at the end of Book 2 of the De Mysteriis. As so often in response to a jibe of Porphyry's, and we might end with that. Granted then that ignorance and deception are faulty and impious, it does not follow on this that the offerings made to the gods and divine works are invalid. For it is not pure thought that unites theurgists to the gods. Indeed, what then would hinder those who are merely theoretical philosophers from enjoying a theurgic union with gods? But the situation is not so. It is the accomplishment of acts not to be divulged and beyond all conception, and the power of unutterable symbols understood solely by the gods, which establishes theurgic union. Hence, we do not bring about these things by intellection alone, for thus their efficiency would be intellectual and dependent upon us. But neither assumption is true, for even when we are not engaged in intellection, the symbols, the synthemata themselves, by themselves, perform their appropriate work. And the ineffable power of the gods, to whom these symbols relate, itself recognizes the proper images of itself, not through being aroused by our thought. That's like I call the sacramental theory, say, theurgy. In a word, then, the gods themselves have sown symbola or synthemata in the material world as instruments of their providence. And it therefore behooves all of us, theurgists or not, to accord matter a proper respect. Thank you.